You're someone who likes to get the big picture quickly, right? Understand what's happening without, spending weeks reading every single article.
Absolutely.
Well, that's exactly what we're about here. We take all the noise and just try to pull out the signal. Today, we're looking at a really interesting development in social media that, well, it feels like we've seen this kind of story before in the tech world.
Yeah, what's fascinating is the emergence of Linkspreed's Web 4 at home. For those keeping an eye on the social media landscape, you'll know this is being talked about as a way for people to, host their own social networks.
Right.
And that immediately brings up the question, could this actually be a real contender against the giants like Meta? It's a classic David and Goliath setup, isn't it?
Absolutely. It rings familiar, doesn't it? You think back to the dawn of personal computers when Apple, this smaller, more nimble company, took on the behemoth that was IBM.
Oh, yeah.
Or, more recently, that very public clash between Epic Games, the Fortnite creators, and Apple over their App Store.
That was a big one.
So our mission in this deep dive is to see if Linkspreed's efforts with Web 4 at home could be, maybe, another chapter in this ongoing story of smaller players challenging the big tech powers.
And to really understand this potential, we've gathered a range of material. We're looking at how Apple positioned itself against IBM with their iconic 1984 Super Bowl commercial. We even have the Wikipedia entry on that one.
A classic.
Then we're examining how Epic Games used, similar tactics with their 1980 Fortnite campaign against Apple.
Right, the parody.
Crucially, we also have information on what Linkspreed is actually offering with Web 4 at home and their Web 4 Lite project. We've also looked at Linkspreed's company profile from Cracksen, just to see where they stand.
Okay.
And some articles outlining the current shifts we're seeing in social media, including the growth of decentralized platforms like the Fediverse.
Okay, so let's start by rewinding to that legendary Apple 1984 commercial. It aired during Super Bowl X8. Gosh, way back in January 1984.
Long time ago now.
Yeah. Now, you might have a vague memory of it, or maybe you've never seen it, but it was anything but a typical ad trying to sell you something directly.
Gal, what made it so powerful was its very cinematic, almost unsettling imagery, directly inspired by George Orwell's novel 1984.
Read the book.
You saw these masses of people marching in lockstep through this very gray industrial environment, all fixated on these massive telescreens broadcasting a Big Brother figure. The symbolism was pretty clear. IBM, which at the time absolutely dominated the personal computer market, was being portrayed as this oppressive, controlling force.
And then, bam, this figure in vibrant color bursts onto the scene, an athlete. Right. A real splash of life against all that grayness.
Exactly, Anya Major. She's carrying a sledgehammer, being chased by these figures who look almost like they're from a dystopian security force.
Yeah.
She winds up and hurls that hammer at the giant screen where Big Brother is droning on.
And it just shatters. It's this incredibly striking visual of breaking free from conformity, from this perceived control. What's really interesting, as you said, is that the commercial never actually showed the Macintosh computer itself.
Nope. The only text you saw was the tagline, "You'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. It was all about the idea of Apple as the alternative.
It was a huge gamble, incredibly bold. I heard that Apple's own board initially hated it. Seriously.
Yeah, that's the story. But Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were completely sold on it. And even though they spent a significant amount, reports vary, but somewhere between, $370,000 and $900,000.
A lot for back then.
Definitely. And they got Ridley Scott, the director of Blade Runner, to direct it.
Wow.
The buzz and free publicity it generated were just enormous.
Absolutely. It's consistently ranked as one of the greatest Super Bowl commercials ever, even being named the commercial of the decade by Advertising Age. But beyond just selling computers, it crafted this powerful narrative for Apple. They were the rebellious underdog, the alternative to IBM's overwhelming dominance. They were positioning themselves as the company that would sort of liberate individuals from this feeling of being under the thumb of a giant corporation.
And that's where we see the first clear parallel with Linkspreed, I think. Just as Apple back then presented itself as the antidote to IBM's grip on personal computing. Linkspreed, with its focus on giving users control over their own social networks through Web 4 at home, is essentially stepping into the ring against the centralized power of today's social media giants like Meta.
It's the same core idea, isn't it? Offering an alternative for individuals who feel constrained by the dominant players.
That's a very insightful way to look at it. And we see a similar strategy, although much more direct and almost a mirror image, in our next example. The conflict between Epic Games and Apple. This really blew up in 2020.
Right. For anyone who might not remember all the details, Epic Games, the company behind the wildly popular game Fortnite,
Hugely popular.
got into a major disagreement with Apple and Google over their App Store policies. The main sticking point was that 30% commission fee that Apple and Google charge on in-app purchases. Yeah.
Exactly. Fortnite was eventually kicked off both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store after Epic Games intentionally introduced a direct payment system within the game that bypassed those App Store fees.
Right. They did it on purpose.
Oh yeah, this wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate move designed to challenge the status quo.
And Epic's response was immediate and, you could argue, pretty clever. They released a video almost instantly called 1980 Fortnite. The name itself is a pretty clear signal of their intentions, echoing Apple's famous ad.
Precisely. It was a direct parody of Apple's 1984 commercial. What's fascinating is how quickly they mobilized. This video was posted on social media almost as soon as Fortnite was removed from the App Store.
Wow.
And they even showed it within the game itself to players who could still access it.
So, okay, imagine the original 1984 ad, but instead of those gray, faceless masses, you have Fortnite characters watching a figure with a giant apple for a head, no prizes, for guessing who that's meant to represent.
Pretty obvious, yeah.
Giving a speech. This Applehead figure is droning on about these platform unification directives.
And just like the colored heroine in Apple's original ad, this speech gets interrupted. A colored Fortnite character runs towards the screen and throws a pickaxe, which is a signature tool in the game, right?
Yeah, pickaxe.
Throws it right at the screen, shattering the image of the apple-headed figure.
And then the text appears, making their message crystal clear. Epic Games has defied the App Store monopoly. In retaliation, Apple is blocking Fortnite from 1 billion devices. Join the fight to stop 2020 from becoming 1984 #free Fortnite.
A direct call to action.
Framing Apple, the company that once positioned itself against Big Brother, as the new oppressor.
What's particularly striking is the language they used publicly and in their legal filings. Epic Games explicitly stated that Apple has become what it once railed against. The behemoth seeking to control markets, block competition, and stifle innovation.
Wow.
It's almost a direct quote of the sentiment behind Apple's 1984 campaign, now turned against them.
It's a real role reversal, isn't it? Apple, the former rebel, now being portrayed as the dominant power stifling innovation.
Totally.
Now, of course, the use of the 1984 theme in this context sparked some debate. Some argued that comparing a dispute over App Store fees to the themes of Orwell's novel was maybe a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
And potentially insensitive to more serious social and political issues happening at the time.
That's a valid point. While the tactic definitely grabbed attention, the analogy didn't fully resonate with everyone, especially considering the significant events happening globally in 2020. However, from a strategic marketing perspective, Epic Games clearly aimed to tap into that existing cultural narrative of tech giants wielding excessive power and the desire for greater freedom and choice.
And once again, we see a clear parallel emerging with Linkspreed. Just as Epic Games challenged Apple's control over its platform and the revenue it generated, Linkspreed's Web4 at Home is aiming to challenge the control that major social media companies have over our data and our online interactions. The idea of freeing users from these centralized platforms and giving them ownership of their data, well, it definitely echoes the #free Fortnite message and the original spirit of liberation in Apple's 1984 ad.
So, with these historical examples of smaller entities challenging larger ones in the tech landscape firmly in mind, let's focus on Linkspreed and their Web4 at Home project itself. Linkspreed is a relatively new company, founded just in 2023.
Pretty recent.
And their core mission seems to be building a social platform that prioritizes decentralization and user control over data through this self-hosting solution.
And Web4 at Home is the key to this, right? It's presented as a way for individuals to run their own social network using relatively inexpensive hardware. Think of a small single-board computer like a Raspberry Pi.
Exactly.
The fundamental idea is to move away from storing all your personal information on massive, centralized servers owned by corporations like Meta.
Exactly. By hosting your own social network, you have direct control over your online identity and your data. You're not subject to the data policies or the algorithms of a single powerful company.
Right.
This approach also has the potential to be more cost-effective in the long run, perhaps, as it bypasses the need for ongoing subscriptions to cloud hosting services.
Now, for someone listening who's intrigued by this, but maybe isn't a super tech expert, can you give us a simplified idea of what's involved in setting up Web4 at home? What kind of technical hoops do you have to jump through?
Sure. Based on their guide, the setup involves a few key technical steps. First, you'd install a lightweight version of the Raspberry Pi operating system, like Raspberry Pi OS Lite. Then you need to enable something called SSH, which is like a secure digital key that allows you to remotely access and manage your Raspberry Pi from another computer.
Got it. Remote access.
Next comes installing Apache 2, which is the software that allows your Raspberry Pi to function as a web server, essentially serving up web pages.
The web server itself.
You'd also need to install PHP, which is a programming language that allows for dynamic content, like the kind you see on social media sites.
It makes it interactive.
And finally, they guide you through setting up a connection through Cloudflare, which helps to securely connect your home server to the internet and provides essential security features like HTTPS, the secure version of web browsing.
Okay, so a few steps involved. Definitely need some technical comfort. They also have another project in the works called Web4 Lite, which they describe as an open source version of a platform similar to Facebook.
Yeah.
It sounds like the self-hosting process for that would be pretty similar, again, emphasizing this idea of individuals being able to create and manage their own social spaces online.
That's right. It really underscores their commitment to making self-hosting more accessible, it seems. However, it's important to consider their current standing. According to their TrackSend profile from April 2025, Linkspreed is currently unfunded and has a relatively low TrackSend score of just 11 out of 100.
11 out of 100. And when you look at the competitive landscape, it's pretty daunting. They list over 1,000 active competitors.
Yeah, it's crowded.
Including the established giants like Facebook, Meta, VK, Rumble, companies with enormous financial resources and massive user bases. For context, Facebook alone has a TrackSend score of 87 out of 100.
Big difference.
It really highlights the sheer scale of the challenge Linkspreed faces, echoing those David versus Goliath scenarios we've been discussing.
It certainly does, but it's also crucial to look at the broader shifts happening in how people are using social media. A recent article in Forbes on social media trends for 2025 pointed out some interesting developments.
Let's do.
Well, one is a growing distinction between traditional social media platforms focused on broadcasting and more interactive media networks. We're also seeing the continued importance of user-generated content and a significant rise in the popularity of smaller, more private online communities.
And perhaps most relevant to Linkspreed's approach, the article mentioned a growing sense of social media fatigue, with users increasingly seeking platforms that prioritize simplicity, authenticity, and genuine connection over the constant barrage of information and algorithmic feeds.
Exactly. People seem to be craving a less overwhelming and more meaningful online experience.
Yeah, I can see that.
And Linkspreed's self-hosting model, by its very nature, aligns with this desire for more control and potentially smaller, more focused online communities. It caters to individuals who are actively seeking alternatives to the large, centralized platform and are willing to take on a bit more technical involvement for greater autonomy.
This also connects with the growing interest in the Fediverse, which you mentioned earlier, as an example of ethical and decentralized social media. For anyone unfamiliar, can you explain how that fits into this picture?
Certainly. The Fediverse is essentially a network of independently run social media servers that can communicate with each other seamlessly. It's decentralized because no single organization owns or controls the entire network.
Okay.
Think of it like email. You could have an account with Gmail or Proton Mail, but you can still exchange emails with people on different providers.
Oh, okay. Good analogy.
Platforms like Mastodon and PixelFed are part of the Fediverse, allowing users on different servers to connect and interact.
So theoretically, someone hosting their own social network using Linkspreed's Web4 at home could potentially connect and interact with users on a completely separate Mastodon server.
That's the underlying principle, yeah. This interconnectedness means users aren't locked into the policies and algorithms of a single company. As some experts have noted, if you're not happy with how one Fediverse community is run, You can potentially move your account to another server without losing your followers or connections.
Interesting. More freedom.
Exactly. This emphasis on user freedom and data ownership is a core value of this emerging decentralized social media landscape. And Linkspreed, with its open source nature and focus on self-hosting, definitely aligns with this broader movement as an alternative to the tech giants' control.
So let's recap. We started by looking at Apple's iconic 1984 ad, which positioned them as the underdog challenging IBM's dominance in the hardware market.
Right.
Then we saw Epic Games' 1980 Fortnite parody, using similar tactics to fight Apple over App Store control. Now we have Linkspreed entering the scene, aiming to offer an alternative to the centralized power of social media giants like Meta by empowering users to host their own decentralized social networks.
The consistent thread we see throughout these examples is this fundamental tension in the tech world between centralized control and the desire for greater user empowerment and decentralization. It's a recurring question of who holds the power and how our digital interactions are shaped.
And that leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. Considering how the Apple versus IBM story played out, with Apple carving out a significant, albeit different, space in the market, and the still unfolding saga of Epic Games versus Apple,
It's still ongoing.
what potential future do you envision for platforms like Linkspreed and the wider movement towards self-hosted and decentralized social networks? What are the critical factors, technological advancements, evolving user behavior, economic realities that will ultimately determine their success or maybe failure in challenging the established giants?
It's definitely a space worth watching. Lots of potential shifts ahead.